In this video, we will try to understand one of the important features provided by .NET 4.0, that is MEF. So what we have done is we have divided this whole video series in several parts. In the first couple of videos, we'll try to understand what is MEF, and we will see a simple example of the same using a console application. And in the later stages, we will try to see how MEF is different from dependency injection and inversion of control. Because if you watch closely DI/IOC, they tend to do the same things, or I'll say their capabilities overlap each other. And finally, what we'll do is, we'll see a sample demonstration of MEF with Silverlight, ASP.NET, and WPF. So let's first try to understand what is MEF all about. MEF is a framework by which you can make your application extensible. For example, you have an accounting application and you would like to provide a hook, or I can say you would like to provide a socket where the external vendors can connect their plug and add invoicing capabilities to the accounting application. So the vendors, they just put the components in the application bin directory, the application discovers them and does the connection and extension. So in other words, MEF is like saying, here's my application, here are the hooks, use the hooks, extend the application as per your needs. In order to make your application MEF enabled, it's a three-step process: import, export, and compose. Import is nothing but basically to create a socket, or else to create the hook where the other applications can connect and extend it. Export is nothing but creating the plug, so your external vendors will create the functionality which they want to import into your socket. And finally, we'll do a compose. In other words, we'll connect the socket with the plug. So in other words, use the import attribute to define the hook, use the export attribute to create the plug, and then finally compose it by using the composition container. Now what we'll do is, we'll do a simple sample of MEF, and we'll see that how these three steps can be implemented in actual Visual Studio. So let's try to demonstrate MEF by using a simple console application. So you can see that I have created a simple console application over here, and currently this application has nothing as such. It just has a static void main, no implementation, nothing. Now what I want is basically, I want to provide functionality to this application where the external vendors can connect and basically extend this application. So what we'll do is, let's create a hook. So here's a simple hook I have created saying plug anything here. Now this property or this function, what it says is that any external vendors can come in here and connect to it. Now in order to expose your hook to the external world, what you need to do is that you need to basically attribute it by the import attribute. Now the import attribute, in order to use the import attribute, you need to basically use two namespaces: system.componentModel.composition and system.componentModel.composition.hosting. So we have done with the first step. We have an application, we have created a hook called as plug anything here, right, where anyone can come in and plug a string implementation, and then we have also attributed the hook by import, and basically we have imported the necessary namespaces. So now the next step is basically our vendors need to provide us implementation. So let's say that our vendor has created a simple class called as CLS MySimpleMessage, which has basically a simple implementation called as here's something for you. Now what the vendor wants is that he wants to basically take this implementation, here's something for you, and connect it to your hook called as plug anything here. So in order to do that, the next step is basically he need to provide some implementation in that socket, or I'll say in his class. So here's a simple implementation where what we are doing is we are just returning a simple string called as message inserted via MEF. And in order to connect to that hook, what he has to do is basically he has to attribute this function by export. So now we have our hook, which has been attributed by the import. We have our socket, which is created by the vendor, which is attributed by export. Now the next step is basically we have to connect both the import and export to extend our application. So let's go ahead and create a simple function or simple method called as compose. And in this method, basically we will write the logic which will bind both the import and the export attributes and extend your console application. So in order to compose, the first thing is we need to get the reference of the assembly. So what we'll do is that we will just use the assembly.get executing assembly. This will basically get us all the assemblies which are currently referenced in your project, or which are basically executing in your project. And from this assembly we'll basically create something called as the assembly catalog. Second, what we need to do is we need to create the composition container object, because we need to add that catalog into the composition container. So the second step what we have done is we are basically gone and we have created the composition container object, and we have added the catalog to the composition container. Now the next step what we need to do is basically we need to say, okay, you have got the assembly and all the assemblies are now in the composition container collection. Can you bind it? In other words, can you start composing or can you start connecting the imports with the exports? So basically what we need to do for that is we need to call the compose parts method and we need to pass the reference of the current object. Now once the parts are composed, the next step is basically to call your property, that is plug anything here. Now because of this function or this I'll say rather this method compose part, what has happened is the exports have got connected to the import. So basically both of them have connected. So in other words, now when you are calling this plug anything here, it's going to basically execute this functionality over here, right? And after that, what I'm doing is I'm just doing a console.read line here so that we can just stop and see what the final output is. And I have called this compose function into my static void main. So I've created the object and basically object of my console application. I have popped it up, and then second I have just called the compose function. So simple. We created the imports, our vendors created the export, and then we basically got the reference of the assembly and we binded them. Now one of the very important point to remember here is that currently my assembly I'm using the get execute assembly. But let's say that if your vendor provides you a DLL, you can always go and use reflection to load the DLL and you can create assembly catalog. So at this moment I'm just using whichever assemblies or DLLs are running in my current application or in my app domain, but I can always go and take up a physical DLL and load it up and bind it on runtime to my imports. So now let's go and run this application. So you can see that basically my application has ran, and basically what it has done is it has basically gone and executed this export functionality which we had created and which we had binded with the import attribute. So you can see that how on runtime basically I was able to extend my application without even touching the current application. Okay, so now that we have done this, the other question which will come to your mind is basically if we define a different data type for the import and export, what will happen? Now remember that one of the important points regarding this connection or regarding this you can say extensibility is that both of the data types should be same, or else it will throw up error. For example, let's say that for some reason I make this as int. Okay, I make the plug anything here as int and I build this. Now if I try to run this, right, it will throw me an error saying that I do not find any exports for this plug anything here. So you can see that the first thing is it has compiled the thing successfully, but because the binding happens on runtime, because the compose part happens on runtime, this will throw an error during the runtime. So if I run this application, it will throw me an error saying that I do not find any kind of export attributes for this import. So here's the error. So you can see that basically what it has said is no valid exports were found to match this constraint or to match the imports. So basically, yes, one of the very important points to remember here is that MEF automatically discovers the DLLs, right, which has exports, and it tries to basically connect those exports to the imports. So if the data types do not match and if the signatures do not match, it will not connect it, and basically it will throw up error which you can see on the screen. Now one of the questions which will come to your mind is basically that regarding the contract. At this moment what we have done is we have defined the contract as a simple .NET data type, that is string. But in real worlds or in real time, what will happen is that you would like to define a contract which is more stringent enough. In other words, probably you would like to define a contract something like a customer contract or must be a supplier contract. So in other words, you would like that this import and export to connect via a predefined contract like an interface. So one of the good points about the MEF framework is that you can define, rather than defining such kind of simple